We are so nimble on this show. We can shift from pediatric surgery to political science.
Yeah. Well, if dealing with infantile brains, it seems like a pretty close connection there with politics these days.
I'll let you say that.
We have Professor Chris Muste from the University of Montana as part of our Political Science on the Radio Day. And you've been doing a lot of research on urban and rural differences when it comes to politics. So I thought it'd be fun to let you tell us what you found.
Sure. Well, we've been...
First of all, welcome back.
Well, thank you very much. Great to be here. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, John. About a year ago, I was working to put together a conference on rural issues in Montana, and it's co-sponsored by the University of Montana and the Lane Center at Stanford University. And the Lane Center has done this.
Yeah, that's certainly rural.
Very rural.
Palo Alto is out in the country.
It was once. But I managed to get the Lane Center to co-sponsor this conference. They've moved it around the West. This is the 4th annual one. We did it here in Missoula in mid-March, and hopefully we'll bring them back in 2 or 3 years. But part of the conference was I managed to get enough funding together to do a survey of Montana residents. And since the focus of the conference is on rural issues, we thought we would target most of the questions on the survey to the rural issues that were covered in the conference. So we looked at 5 main topic areas. We looked at the qualities that people enjoy about Montana, the problems they think are happening in Montana, and the leaders of Montana. We looked at healthcare and healthcare access, and we looked at natural resources and public lands. We looked at tribal law and policy, and we looked at homelessness. So we did this survey. It was about a 20-minute survey, interviewed about 923 Montanans across the state by telephone, and came up with the results which we presented at the conference, and we have here as well.
Now, did you specify when you called these numbers, did you specifically call small communities, or did you include like Missoula, Billings, Bozeman, and larger communities?
We wanted to get a representative sample of the entire state, and we wanted to compare rural attitudes to small town attitudes and urban attitudes. And so we essentially did a random sample, representative sample of the entire state using cell phones and landlines, and
How'd you get the cell phone numbers for that?
They are available for sale. Right. It's possible to get those. So anyway, it was a very well done survey, very professionally done survey, and we're happy to get those results.
So what was the most surprising thing that you saw from the data? I mean, you live here, so
I do.
One would assume you probably got your thumb on the political attitudes of Montana, but I bet you there was something that kind of blew your hair back.
Well, we don't have many polls in Montana, so we don't, especially focused on issues. Sometimes we'll have polls that focus on things like who's ahead in an election race or what people think of the candidates. I'd say the things that surprised me most were that Montanans seemed to hold multiple opinions about similar issues. So, for example, we found that almost 60% of Montanans were very concerned, very or extremely concerned about climate change, which I found kind of surprising. I didn't think that was a hot issue, and that included, I think, a slim majority of people in rural areas. So they seem to be seeing some consequences of climate change in rural areas.
Well, if there is climate change, you would think folks who are involved in agriculture are quite literally on the ground dealing with land and water and crops and things like that.
Absolutely.
That would be at the top of their mind.
Absolutely. So I think they're seeing it, in their own work, in their own lives in rural areas. But at the same time, there was this concern about climate change. There was also similarly strong support in the 50+ % range for continued development, including continued development of fossil fuels. And there was support for transfer of some public lands, federal public lands, to the state. So there were sort of a mix of views. You couldn't sort of characterize the views as consistently conservative or consistently liberal among the majority of Montanans.
Gotcha. So I'm curious from what your viewpoint is, like, why are those in any way clashing against each other? Why would it be inconsistent to want to decrease greenhouse emissions and also want to cede federal lands back to the states?
Well, I think that, when we listen to most political discourse in this country, we tend to think of it as
it's very polarized.
Exactly, polarized. I was going to say bipolar, but I guess that's a psychiatric diagnosis that I maybe shouldn't be using.
How many degrees does this guy got?
Polarized, I like that. Right, and so we tend to think of that people who are concerned about climate change are more likely to favor environmentalism over development when there's a forced choice question. But we found that there are a fair number of Montanans who do hold both of those values and hold them very strongly. They're concerned about climate change, but they also favor development. They're concerned about, or another good example in this survey was they really don't like the Affordable Care Act, but they also really like the fact that the state expanded Medicare or Medicaid, and so they're concerned about the fiscal responsibility, but they also think that the state does a pretty good job of spending their money. So when there's a surplus, they'd prefer that it went into supporting state programs rather than getting it back in tax cuts. So there's a mix of what you'd call sort of classically conservative and classically liberal points of view that we see in the survey.
Why do you think Montana has that issue?
I think Montanans may be a little more open-minded and focus more on sort of policy concerns and the issues themselves than listening to sort of the polarized discourse or debate among political leaders. And so I think Montanans are fairly practical, fairly pragmatic. There's a large percentage of Montanans who are independents, don't really strongly adhere to one of the two major parties. And so I think Montanans may, on different issues, be willing to take different sides of the issue or see some middle ground.
How much do you think of this holds true for the rest? I mean, because the conference was on rural and urban politics.
Yes.
If Montana is this freak of nature that you've described, how well can we cross-apply the lessons we've learned here to the rest of the country?
Tell you what, we'll hang it. We'll get that when we come back. We got to take a break. We have all three lines open. What do you think of Professor Muste's survey? Is this something that if you had answered those questions, would you have come up with the same answers as the ones who responded? What do you think? All three lines are open. Want to test out these new phone lines? Come on, guys. By the way, it sounds really clean. 721-1290 is our number, and we'll be right back. All right. 721-1290 is the number. And, we have a caller. Oh, we also have a Facebook post.
We do. We'll get our caller on. Let's do our caller first.
So this is so exciting. Okay, very first.
All right, don't break this system here, Larry.
The very first caller. Hi, Larry. How are you?
Good morning.
Oh my gosh, it sounds like you're right next door.
Good. I am just up the street. So,
what's going on?
I wanted to ask your guest if this information has been used or will it be used in the redistricting of legislative districts, because I know one of the districts I'm in changed and eliminated the urban areas, so it reflects more of a rural nature in the voting districts. And so I wondered if this information will be used by the legislative redistricting group.
Good question. I think the answer is definitely not. The redistricting procedure that takes place in the state of Montana, they use census data. And our data, we only have 923 respondents throughout the state. And we purposely, even though we know what zip codes they're in, we don't have any more detailed data about where they live. So we can't really connect people and their opinions to where they live. So this would not be very useful data for redistricting.
That being said, the people doing the redistricting can choose to use other sources, right? I mean,
I believe they can. I don't think there's anything limiting the data that they use.
Yeah, go ahead, Larry.
But they could use this general information to reflect the differences between what issues are concerning folks in urban areas versus folks in rural areas.
Yes, they could make. Yeah, they could
but
make.
They do have split districts.
Oh yeah, they could make generalizations based on our survey about urban versus small city versus rural areas and what kinds of opinions are prevalent in each of those areas.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Hey, thanks,
Thank
Larry.
you.
Appreciate it. Now, Chris, let's say I'm politician A and John is politician B. Okay. And I want to use your survey to try to figure out how I can best develop. When I'm going to a town that has some agricultural stuff and also has right next door has some oil wells and coal, all that. So how do I frame my message so that I can get the best advantage from your survey?
Lion Crook politician A is trying to deceive the public by acting like he knows what he's talking about with this information.
Well, I would say that this is most candidates for office do much more specific, much more concrete surveys than this, where they're sort of message testing either specific kinds of language that they might use or specific kinds of policy positions they might take. We did not do any of that. We were trying to use very straightforward questions to find Montana's views. Yeah, right. Exactly. So if I were advising a politician or a candidate for office, I would say, look, you've got in most districts. I don't know about specific districts, but if you're running statewide, you really do need to appeal to a broad set of perspectives on the issue. There is actually a center in Montana. This is not a state like Utah, which is highly conservative, where most of the elected officials statewide and in the legislature and even in most small communities are Republican. This is a bipartisan state with people who have views all over the map. There's a big group of people in the middle who can think of themselves as moderate or moderately conservative or moderately liberal or independent. There's not a lot of polarization here. And so you've got to be able to talk to people who are both concerned about climate change and concerned about economic development and figure out a way to do that.
A couple questions from Katie. She says, and we'll just go through the questions one by one. First, how are the questions phrased? I mean, that's probably a hard one to answer without reading every question, but
it is, and we don't have that much time. There were, I think, 73 questions on the survey, plus demographic questions.
Well, the follow-up question might help her out there. Yeah. Is there a place where we can find the questions online?
The preliminary results have been posted at the Stanford Lane Center website, the Bill Lane Center for the American West. They've also been posted, thanks to Montana Public Radio, on their website. I'm in the process of writing the final report, and I expect to have that done in mid-May. When that's finished, it will be published on the University of Montana's political science website and on the Bill Lane website at Stanford University. And
what the other question she had was, are they multiple choice? I mean, it was like, are you concerned about climate change? A, we're all going to die. B, or is it like a scale of 1 to 10? I'm very concerned, not very concerned.
Most of them were scale questions because those are the easiest questions for people to understand, and those are the kinds of questions you don't want to ask people sort of multiple questions within a single question because, for example, if you ask people about, well, what do you think about Barack Obama's effectiveness on the economy and foreign policy, people are going to answer that question maybe based on their views of President Obama's effectiveness on foreign policy, or maybe they'll do it based on the economy. So you want simple, straightforward questions. So he's very simple question wording, a lot of scales, like are you very concerned, somewhat concerned, not very concerned, not at all concerned, things like that.
You don't ask questions like, how much do you hate?
We did try to avoid what you might call leading questions. So
Politician A specializes in these type of questions.
You might wonder about that, Politician A person.
Anyway, we're almost up against the break. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, when we get back, I wanted to ask you what you think you might have learned. I mean, you've already talked about learning about the polarization in Montana, right. Something unique you found out. Give us some more lessons. You did all this work. Tell us what you got out of it.
All right, we'll do.
When we come back, and by the way, all three of our brand new phone lines are open at 721-1290. So check them out, test them out, and we will be right back. And that's 721-1290. Thanks for joining us on Talkback. Brought to you this morning by Bull's Eyewear. They offer some of the lowest prices in town on contact lenses. See Lynette, 2910 South Reserve. Nissan Hyundai of Missoula celebrating their grand opening sale, offering top dollar for your trade-in and 0% financing for up to 72 months. And by Selway Armory on Stockyard Road. More guns and ammo than anyone in Missoula. The best prices at Montana, Montana's premier firearms dealer. Okay, here we are. We're back, and we have a caller, and we have more Facebook questions. So let's jump right to the phones and say good morning to JR. Hi, JR.
Hi. Yeah, I think this climate change question, for example, would be answered a lot differently if they specified, do you believe it's man-made climate change or natural climate change? And when you do that, you're going to get a completely different set of responses because the majority of people I've talked to over the last 2 years believe it's natural climate change. And, first they called it man-made global warming, then they had to change it to just global warming, then it was man-made global climate change, then they had to change it to climate change. And if you've noticed in the last few months, hardly ever do you ever hear anybody from the left call it man-made climate change. It's always just climate change. And now their newest is climate disruption. So there's a big difference in the question when you ask people whether they believe it's natural climate change or man-made climate change.
Is that anything that was involved in your survey?
So when we did this survey, one of the things that we did was we looked at other survey organizations and the way that they'd ask questions and tried to find the ones that were most neutral, that were less likely, used most neutral language, that were less likely to have those kinds of problems that the caller's referring to, where people hear one kind of terminology and they associate it, very strongly with some emotional response that they have. So we were trying to use the most neutral language that we could. Surveys that have done tests that ask some of their respondents about climate change and ask other of their respondents about global warming have found some differences, especially among conservatives in the way they respond to that question, but not so much among moderates and liberals. And I think the caller's right that if we asked about whether people thought it was man-made versus due to natural sources, probably you'd get some percentage giving each one of those answers, but you'd probably also get a lot of people saying, well, it's some sort of combination. It may be part of a natural cycle, but it may also be contributed to by man-made sources.
Anything else, JR?
But we didn't ask that question, and so I'd be speculating to say that.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just fed up with this. They change it to global climate change, so no matter if it's too hot or too cold, it's man-made. It's because of man. If it's drought or too much rain or floods, it's because of man. Too many tornadoes or very few tornadoes, it's it's because of man-made climate change. So they got it either way is what they use that either way.
Well, there's a lot of political capital in there, JR.
Well,
yeah.
Rest your mind. Political candidate B will fight for climate disturbance.
The disruption.
No, I'm changing it. Your terminology is outdated, outmoded.
All right, thanks, JR. Thanks for the call. All right,
climate
Mike.
discomfort.
Yeah, climate discomfort. I like that.
Yeah.
This is a laxative for that.
I have a pain in my climate. Okay,
Yeah.
Mike, you're on Talkback. Hi.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Well, let's talk climate change. We'll start with that one. By the way, your guest does not know who I am, but I used to do a lot of polls for that radio station. If you remember, going back over 20 years ago, I did snap polls all over Missoula. So I know a little bit of polling, but here's my question. I ask people about climate change, and I ask every one of them this. You believe there's climate change or we're global? Yeah. I said, then I have one question for you. If all the ice floating in the Arctic Ocean melted tomorrow, how high would the ocean rise? Almost 99%. Well, I don't know. It could be huge. And then you look at it and say, you couldn't measure it. It's the same as ice cubes in a glass of water. Oh, and I said, that's how they get you with climate change, because you don't know what's going on. And you should know, and you do know the answer if you thought about it. That is what every time I come up with climate change. And if you want to see climate change, and if we talk a little longer, I say, you go up to the top floor of St. Pat's, look at that mountain just east of you, and them little terraces are where the little Lake Glacier was, Missoula's glacier was, or
right.
lake was. Every one of them little lines is where the level of the water was over the years that had filled and re-emptied less than 12,000 years ago. And so if you were standing there, you'd be under a couple 100 feet of water. So, yeah, but that's just my way of doing it. And I ask all kinds of people this. So,
all right, Pastor. Thank you.
Thanks,
right.
Mike. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Vote candidate B.
All three lines are open, by the way. It's 721-1290.
So I wanted to get back to you, Chris, on some of the things that you've learned. One of the things you had mentioned was how polarized Montana was, or I guess kind of discombobulated, siding with two sides of the political spectrum at
Right,
times, it looked
right.
like to you. Any other lessons you think you've learned?
Well, just to clarify, I would say Montanans are somewhat polarized, but polarization we usually think of as having sort of a lot of people on the extreme of one side of an issue and a lot of people on the extreme of the other side.
Sure.
I think one of the things that's interesting about Montanans is we seem to sort of take the middle on several issues, or seem to take points of view that might be seen as contradictory, or taking both sides of the issue on some issues. So there's that concern with climate change, but there's also an emphasis on development. There's another thing I found interestingly about public lands, which was that even though people supported some public lands transfer from the federal government to the state, there was a lot of opposition to the takeover at the Malheur Wildlife Refuge, and about a large proportion of the respondents thought, when we asked them question about whether they thought the takeover was good and should be supported, or whether the people who participated in the takeover should be arrested. Most people thought the people should be arrested at the takeover. So,
I would have answered the same way. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm totally for transferring lands back to the state.
right.
Totally against the Mahler acquisition
Yeah.
by force.
Right. So I think there's that. I think there's sort of both strong opinions in Montana, but also I think there's this moderation. And another thing that came through as a real strong theme in this survey was how many times people sort of thought the state was doing a good job, or thought a state solution, a Montana solution, was really the best way to go. So you could see that in people disliking the Affordable Care Act, but really liking the Medicaid expansion. When we asked the question about the budget surplus in the state, most people said, let the state use it, don't return it in tax refunds.
Seriously.
That's why both politician A, B, and C always say Montana made solutions.
Right,
Like,
that's
whenever they
that's-
advertise some political.
We could have used that language in our survey, and I think it would have just garnered 80% support every time.
We're going to come right back. 721-1290. And Earl, we'll get your call on. I want to give you plenty of time to make your point. So hang on. We'll be back in a moment. We have two lines open at 721-1290. Stay with us. Oh, we are back on Talkback. 721-1290. And we're spending an hour with Professor Chris Muste with the Political Science Department at the University of Montana. And let's get right to the phones. Earl, you're on Talkback. Hi.
Good morning, gentlemen.
Hi.
I was curious. I may not have heard the whole interview so far, but two questions. One, what was the format for the survey? Was it like phone or mail-in? And what level of participation did you have with the people that were contacted? And maybe a third question, how do you think the impact to the survey's data was attributable to people who did not respond?
All good questions.
All right. Thanks, Earl. Appreciate the call.
Great questions. First of all, it was a telephone survey. It took about 20, actually on average, we thought it was going to take about 20 minutes. It took about 26 minutes. Montanans really wanted to talk about the issues that they're concerned over. We used both cell phones and landlines to make sure that we got both the younger folks who tend to use those cell phone things and older folks who tend to use landlines. So we got a pretty good balance age-wise. In terms of the whether the results would have been, I'm sorry, I forgot your third question.
I didn't write it down either.
Bad me. Well, the questions would have been different if we'd used a different mode, I think was your question. Or the answers would have been different. The answer is no, I don't think so. But a big problem, I know what it was. The big problem is what we call non-response in surveys, and this has been getting worse and worse. And we will probably not see many telephone surveys in the near future because it is extremely expensive to conduct a telephone survey. It's much easier to conduct an internet survey, even though they're not as accurate in getting a fully representative sample of the state of Montana or the adult population of the United States. But phone surveys are extremely expensive, mostly because people don't answer the phone. And so in our survey, we had, I think, about 16% of the numbers that we called, we actually talked to a live person, and of those, a little over half actually completed the survey.
Yeah, because let's be honest, when it's 6 o'clock and I'm sitting down to dinner or down to watch Bill O'Reilly or whatever it might be, and the phone rings, hello, thanks, and I'm busy, I'm doing stuff.
Yep.
Does that happen a lot?
It does happen a lot. And the other thing that happens is people who are using their cell phones and get a number that they look at and they think, I don't know that number. They just don't answer the phone or they answer it and hang up. Even though survey organizations, legitimate political survey organizations, are dialing those numbers legally, and in virtually every case, they're actually covering any kind of cost that if you're on like a per call cell plan, they cover those costs.
let me ask you the question: how much did it cost to run this survey, or are you allowed to say? Is that confidential?
That's confidential information, but it took a huge amount of time to raise that.
It was
that money.
privately funded, right?
It was funded through both universities. Yeah.
Okay, so there was some public money involved from the University of Montana.
Oh yes,
in that.
yes.
Okay,
it was split between the two universities.
Okay.
But let me just say, it was so difficult to raise the funds that I'm not sure I'm ready to do another one in the near future. It was really eye-opening. And we did investigate doing an internet survey in the state of Montana, but unfortunately we don't have as much internet connectivity in the state, so it would be very difficult to get 1,000 interviews over the internet in a short period of time, as we were trying to do.
Okay, here's one of the things that I think would bias the test, or could bias the test.
Okay.
Is the recency of the person to Montana.
Yeah.
So did you screen out the length of time that someone had been calling themselves a Montanan?
We did not screen out. We did ask people how long they had lived in Montana, and we found that most of our respondents had lived in Montana over 10 years, and that half of our respondents had lived in Montana all of their lives.
Wow.
So we haven't completed the final analysis yet, but one of the things we are looking at is comparing people who are relatively new to Montana to people who are not so new to Montana.
So it takes a while for us to Montana-ize them. Is that it?
Well, that's the theory. That's John's theory. I'm sorry, that's Candidate B's theory.
Candidate B.
And Candidate B, we will get
it's
you
not
some
a
information
theory.
on that.
It's the facts.
That's what
Don't make me slap you with these huge hands.
That's one of the reasons we do political science. We do political science to test these theories, Candidate B, and to see if your huge hands are correct in determining.
I can count up to 10.
That's good.
With
both
my shoes on. Yeah.
All right.
Okay, we're up against a break. It's getting pretty weird in here. 721, we need your help. 721-1290 is our number. If you'd like to take our survey, would you mind calling us? 721-1290 is our number. So we'll be right back. Stay with us. All right, we're back on Talkback. 721-1290 is our number. All three lines open. Professor Chris Muste joining us from the Political Science Department at the University of Montana.
Now, politician A wants to shield the public from the truth, but I want to cover everything you learned about. I want to talk a little bit about.
Let me interrupt you. Let me interrupt you right now.
I want to talk about the two categories we really haven't touched on. One was homelessness. The other one was tribal lands.
Okay. So regarding tribal law and policy, we asked a preliminary question. A first question we asked was how people viewed the concept of tribal sovereignty, which is an important issue. Montana has a large number of tribal reservations, and so the legal issues involved with that are very important for the state. Most Montanans, about over 60%, viewed the idea of tribal sovereignty in negative terms. So that's very large negative opinion about that.
Do you have any sort of a percentage?
62%.
Wow. Okay.
But then when we asked about specific issues related to tribal sovereignty, so for example, the State Water Compact with the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, there was an identical level of approval. 63% of the public approved of the compact, 59% approved of the Kerr Dam transfer, even larger percentage of the public supported things like land repurchases of tribal lands by the tribes. Coal development by the tribes was approved by 73% of the public. About 3/4 of the public believed that the tribes controlled about the right amount or not enough of resources on or around tribal lands.
Did you ask about fireworks? Because up until the age of 18, that's the only thing I knew about the tribal lands was fireworks.
You get fireworks?
Yeah.
Well, here in Montana, in Missoula, you can get fireworks legally. You can buy them even though you can't actually set them off a lot of the time. So I don't know if that's still a current issue, John, but...
I'll take you out to the fireworks stands this summer, Chris.
Yeah.
You'll see the difference. You'll see it
really?
firsthand, yeah.
So we're talking
Politician B will even buy you a firework.
Really?
Yeah.
I think that
Not
could
your
be
vote,
considered,
just the firework.
I was going to say that could be considered bribery. I'll have to look at the political science definition of that.
I'm calling Jonathan Model on you.
Oh.
Yeah. Look, you should see. He just got pale, just like this. Boom, just like that.
And so we also found that people really supported the Indian Education for All Act, that over half of the respondents said it covered about the right amount, and about 40% more respondents said they wanted more material in K through 12 on Indian Education for All. So there was an interesting split. This idea of tribal sovereignty is very disliked, but it doesn't, when you apply it to specific kinds of policies, at least the ones that we asked about, there seems to be strong support for the tribes. So there's either something about that term that just sets people off, or there are other policies that they associate with tribal sovereignty that we did not ask about. And so if we do a survey again, when we hope to get this conference back in Missoula in 2 or 3 years' time, we'll ask additional sets of questions about different aspects of sovereignty.
Yeah, I bet you that word sovereignty is what threw people off.
Right. And different people may, as I said, I think they may be associating different things with it, and so it just means different things to different people.
Well, it is a very specific legal definition that a lot of folks, you think you're sovereign, you think you're a king. This is my territory, I can do whatever I want here. That's not necessarily true.
But the actual tribal sovereignty, and we actually had to do this for the survey, we actually had to provide a brief definition of what tribal sovereignty was.
What is it?
Well, I don't have the definition right with me.
Okay.
But we did check with actually one of the law professors at the University of Montana, Monty Mills, who's an expert on this area, and he provided us with a very helpful short definition. And when people in the survey asked, well, what is tribal sovereignty, we were able to read them this brief definition, and most people were able to answer the question then.
Great. Let's get to the phone and say hi to Gregan. Gregan, what's on your mind, sir?
Good morning, gentlemen. A question for you. Were temporary residents included in the survey?
Temporary meaning?
Students?
Like students who are going to the university who are going to go home.
So the way that the sample of respondents was drawn was there's a couple of large survey organizations that maintain databases of telephone numbers. And so we asked them to draw numbers that were either definitely or extremely likely to have Montana origins, to have been purchased in Montana for cell phones or landlines that were only in Montana.
So you didn't call 243 numbers for the University of Montana or for like MSU or?
Probably no. Those exchanges should have been excluded because they're non-residential. So it should have been only residential exchanges. But on cell phones, you can't tell whether it's a residential or a business exchange. And we did ask a question up front about whether the person was a Montana resident. So if somebody is here temporarily, we didn't ask that question specifically, but they should have answered. If in that initial screening question, they should have said, well, no, I'm only here temporarily. But, we also would not have been, we would have been fine with having students answer the questions because, say, a student who's a formal resident out of state who then comes to Montana to go to college could register to vote in the state of Montana, and so they would have a political impact in Montana. We'd want to assess their views as well. Okay.
Now, the second question would be, well, wouldn't that be biased to a individual from Florida?
It might, but we asked people their county of residence at the end of the survey, and we also found the greatest difficulty we had in this survey was getting people to respond to the survey who are under the age of 30.
I see.
We spent a lot of time trying to track those people down, and frankly spent a lot of money doing that too. And so most of the people that we got who were under the age of 30 said they'd lived in Montana either over 10 years or all their lives.
Or smiley face with cat ears.
So we got very few out-of-state residents in this survey.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
Thanks for the call. Yeah. So why do you think you had such a hard time getting young people to respond to the survey?
Well, if I ask my students, which I do in my class all the time, almost none of them have landlines at home. Right. And most of them, when they see a number that is not from a Montana area code, they hang up. In fact, when they see any number that is not one of their friends, they simply don't answer it. Or they'll answer it, and then if it's anything that's going to take them more than 2 minutes, as you yourself said, Peter, if you're busy, you're just going to, you're making dinner, you're watching television, you're listening to KGVO on the radio, you say, oh, I'm sorry, I'm doing something way too much.
I'm trying to listen to the talkback show.
One of those things you can do while doing other things.
And so the person will say, I'm doing something way too important, I'm going to hang up, goodbye.
Yeah. Or we're going to take a break, but we're not saying goodbye yet. We have all three lines open. Go ahead, John.
I was just going to say, vote politician B for sovereign.
We'll be right back. My little Chicago Jones on here today. 721-1290 is our number, 1-800-568-5309. Go ahead, John.
Question from Elena. She says, isn't using a survey the first step of the Delphi technique? A process paid for by groups having a predetermined outcome as the final result.
I'm not familiar with the term Delphi technique.
Well, here's if I could, and Elena, please forgive me, but here's what I think the Delphi technique is.
Politician A would be an expert on this.
Perceived to be, okay, is they start with a survey, and then they have a predetermined outcome, and then they'll have a meeting. They'll draw people in, and then they'll divide up into groups, and then each group will have a pre-selected head of that group to help guide the discussion to get people to agree to the thing that they wanted in the first place, to make it look like it was arrived at by public consensus.
All right. I do study public opinion. I read a lot about public opinion.
At least that's what I think it is. For the way it was described to me.
And I haven't heard of this before, but there are techniques that are used. Obviously, there are surveys that are done with the intention of finding a specific outcome, and there are ways you can bias questions, bias people in the course of the survey.
Should the city condemn the water company survey would be maybe a good example of this.
Or any question that is leading, that uses loaded language, that makes associations between one of the sides that's being asked about and something negative. So there's a lot of ways to do that. There's a whole science of it. It actually comes out of the advertising business to a large extent, and market research. But our survey, we looked at what's essentially the state of the art questions that are being used by the best survey organizations to try to avoid any kind of language that would bias people's answers or push them towards any kind of viewpoint on the survey.
All right, let's cover homelessness before we run out of time here.
All right. Well, we interestingly found that very few people, well, not very few people, but only about a third of the respondents thought that homelessness across the state was an extremely serious problem or a very serious problem. But interestingly enough, 42% actually said they personally knew someone who is homeless or had become homeless or experienced a spell of homelessness in the previous 2 years. So there's a really strong, two-fifths of Montanans know someone who's been homeless. So it's even though people don't perceive it as a widespread problem, they themselves have experience of it, which is really unusual for a social problem. The other thing that we found was that people didn't agree on what the cause of homelessness was. People related it to low wages or drug addiction or problems on the part of the individual or the cost of housing.
Mental health issues.
Other kinds of issues. No agreement on whether government should be responsible for dealing with it, or the families of homeless people, or nonprofits, or churches and religious organizations. One thing we did find, though, was just really stark support for additional government spending on housing to try to alleviate at least the sort of chronic homelessness problem. And then one thing that you asked earlier, John, what surprised me in the survey, I'd say maybe the single most surprising finding was that when we asked people if they'd be willing to have a homeless shelter or homeless housing sited within a mile of their house, 70% of Montanans said they would be willing to.
Really?
Really.
Wow.
That's what I said, wow. And that's both rural and urban support for siting homeless housing within a mile of their houses.
So they said yes or no?
They said yes.
They said yes?
Yes.
Wow. So the NIMBY was not,
The NIMBY was IMBY, in my backyard. I'm willing to have some homeless housing within a mile of my house.
We had another caller wanted to know whether or not political affiliation was something you screened for or asked about.
We did. We asked people both their ideological affiliation. Do they consider themselves liberal, conservative, or moderate? And we also asked people their party identification.
Tell me about the liberal conservative, because I've heard for a long time even liberals consider themselves conservatives here. Is that true? Is that different?
So the term conservative has a much more positive sort of sound to most people than liberal. And so we found that there was I can't remember exactly what the figures were, but I think it was about 45% conservative and about 30% moderate and about 25% liberal. We found a pretty even party split between Republicans and Democrats, I think about 8% more Republicans than Democrats. But compared to most of the states around us, there was a large percentage of independents. And so both of those analyses of both ideology and party identification will be in our final report.
So between politician A and lion politician B, as we go around the state, we got the primaries coming up in June, a little more than a month away.
Right.
So as a political science professor,
yes.
So you've obviously been studying this. Where is Montana at right now? I mean, if the primaries were to be held today,
I'd say Montanans are fairly happy. Most Montanans thought the state was going in the right direction. They were willing to let the state take care of a lot of policy issues and to use the budget surplus. Montana's elected officials we asked about, Bullock, Daines, Tester, and Zinke. All of them had large majorities positively towards them, although Zinke wasn't known by a large percentage of the state. So I'd say Montanans are pretty happy with the way things are going. It doesn't mean they don't think they could go better. But I'd say if I was an incumbent office holder running for re-election and I was running a fairly good job, I'd feel fairly good about my chances.
Okay.
Wow. So curious what you think about the federal election. With what you've learned, the urban-rural divide in Montana,
yeah.
Any candidates stick out like they're sending the message that Montanans want to hear?
You mean among the presidential
candidates?
candidates?
The presidential candidates, yeah.
I don't know that I see much
very
resonance.
uncomfortable right now.
Well, I'd say in general terms, I would say candidates, and I haven't looked separately at the different parties, so I don't know, for example, on the Republican side, how strongly resonant really conservative views are going to be. And as I said, we didn't ask about the presidential candidates, so we don't know directly whether people think positively of
He's not going to answer
Trump and Kasich and Cruz.
I think we've got politician C on the air now.
But I think there's going to be a real dogfight in both parties. I think they're going to put some resources into this. It's going to be sort of a rerun of 2008.
We're out of time.
And so we're going to have an exciting time in Montana in June.
Excellent. But tomorrow, World Affairs Council?
Yeah, we'll be speaking with a high-level fiscal analyst.
Have a great day, everybody.